Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today here on the soundstage at our Johannesburg offices. We're outside, so you might hear a little bit of traffic. Today we will be having a discussion around PoPIA, Protection of Personal Information Act, and how implementation can actually benefit your business. So joining me here today, I've got a few panelists. Let's start with Anton Kotze. He is a lawyer with more than 20 years of experience providing consultation and legal services to a variety of companies, especially in the ICT industry. Then we have Richard Frost, our head of cybersecurity. He's our head of product at Amata. And Richard, you've got 25 years of experience.
That's correct.
Specifically in cybersecurity.
Yep.
And then lastly, we've got Steve Simmons from Wolfpack. He heads up the Wolfpack advisory division, and you've got 27 years of experience specifically in governance, risk, and compliance industry. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Anton, I'm going to start with you. As an attorney, you're quite involved in advising companies regarding the legal aspects of PoPIA. Could you briefly explain to us what is PoPIA, what it entails, why is it important, and also who it applies to?
Sure. So PoPIA deals with, at its core and in its essence, with the processing of personal information, right through the life cycle of that information, from the collection of it to the processing for a particular purpose, how you store it, how you keep it safe, and eventually how you destroy it or get rid of it. It's in place, and PoPIA is there to protect essentially a basic and fundamental human right of which is the right to privacy. And if that right to privacy is breached, it can lead to dire consequences. For example, identity theft. Identity theft. We know of so many stories where people want to get married, they find out they've already been married, or it could lead to financial losses where all of a sudden you're faced with accounts, overdue accounts that you never knew about. So it's really important that we protect that right to privacy, and PoPIA entrenches that through, like I've explained, through that life cycle of the information. And it really applies to anybody, any person. There's a few exceptions in the Act, but it applies to any person that will process or use or have in its possession information about private PI, personal information sorry, of individuals or companies. Whether you're small, whether you're large, an enterprise or a small little business, it applies equally to everybody.
Steve, I'm going to come to you. Wolfpack works very closely with Amata, providing a PoPIA advisory service. Could you please tell us more about the consultative approach that you do and how you investigate with companies in order to become compliant?
Thanks, Janet. Look, for us, it's normally a three-phase approach. The first phase, probably the most important, where you look at establishing the steering committee for PoPIA within the business, because a top-down approach is very important. That you've got the commitment of leadership at the top, and they understand the requirements, and then appointing your information officers or your deputy information officers has to happen then as well, and then of course the training of those individuals as well is very important, and not just general training, but a more detailed deep dive into the Act itself. Moving on from there, we would now look at then doing a compliance audit, a PoPIA compliance audit that is more of a, I call it a blueprint, for the journey, because it will come up a lot in our discussions today that PoPIA is a journey, and that we use that going forward. The next step after that is to look at data mapping, where we look at across the whole business to see exactly what type of personal information they have, where it's located, etc. Is it within the business? Is it outside the business? Shared with other organizations? Is there other organizations processing on your behalf? Do you share that processing, etc.? And then beyond that, obviously, we'd look at also the risks involved. And are there any impact assessments you need to do on certain parts of the business, depending on what you find with the risk. So the risk is a very important part. On from there, you're looking at then the documentation, like helping with the PoPIA policy manual, helping with the PIA manual, all the sort of forms you have for PoPIA that are needed, that you have to have in place. Most of those you can download off the web, by the way, to be honest with you. They're all available at the information regulator. But then the more key ones are the more IT-related ones, which would be your acceptable use policies, your mobile device policies, your social media policies, and a number of others. So that's the sort of approach we take. Yeah.
Now, Steve, if a business wants to implement PoPIA correctly, where do they start? What are the key steps that they need to take?
Well, I think the main part really is to develop your privacy policy at the highest level. I think that's the first thing you need to have in place, and that needs to be signed off. It's an important document. It's actually the heart of the business when it comes to your documentation. And then obviously that document also needs to refer to everything else. Another way of looking at it would be to look at it as is, a sort of audit of yourself, a self-assessment, or you can get a partner to do it for you, where you look at where you are now and where you'd like to be, and then moving forward, drafting all the rest of your policies again, and then maybe again looking at another gap analysis and seeing where you are. So again, it's going through that journey, doing the enhancements, designing your solutions around what you need, because it's different for every business. That's the key here. It's never going to be the same for everybody. And I think from a small business to a large corporation, it will vary. Okay.
Steve, you mentioned data mapping, personal information mapping, PI mapping. Why is it important? And explain us why it is recommended.
Okay, first thing I'd like to say on that, Jeanette, is two aspects of it. The one is it's data, but remember it's also records. So there's two aspects to this. Records would be hard copies of information, which could be kept in your drawer, in your cupboard,
on your desk,
in a filing cabinet. It could be sitting at Metrofile as archives. It's still a document. It's still got information on it. That's the first thing. So you'd need to know where that information is. But more importantly, from a data point of view, is obviously, if you look at it from the process of it. Okay, so the first thing you need to know is what type of personal information do I have? That's the first thing. And then what type of data subject? Is it employees? Is it customers, etc.? And when we look at personal information, it's a lot broader than you think. A lot of people think it might be just an ID number or a phone number, but it's not just that. Because remember, it's businesses as well as people. There's two aspects there. So it's business registration details. It's also company information, health information, biometrics, CCTV, pictures, you name it. So it covers a broad area, and I'm not going to go into all of it. So once you know that, then the next part of it when you're doing mapping is to say, well, okay, this is the information we've got. This is where the type of information we have and what it's on in data format or record format. But now where is it located? And this is when it gets interesting, because then you can say, okay, well, it sits on this server in our data center, but hang on a minute, we've got some stuff that sits in the cloud, or we've got some stuff that's sitting on someone's laptop or on a mobile phone, or a number of other places, and those are the locations. So you need to know those as well. So what you're saying here really is that it goes to that level of detail that you need to know exactly where it is. The other interesting one is the sharing of information, which if you look at the regulator, sharing means I pass something on to you, but you don't actually process it. But the regulator doesn't see it any differently. They look at it as processing, and a lot of people need to understand that. So to do that exercise, if you do it properly, it helps you a lot because it makes the people aware of you're working with. Because what I found a lot is they're quite amazed when you go through the exercise because they just realize, wow, you know, I never realized there was so much information in this business. So that data mapping to me is really a crucial part.
If I can just jump in there, it's what information do I have? Where is that information kept? But also, why do I have it?
Yes.
Because there's a principle of minimality in PoPIA. So I must only have the information that I really need, and I must only keep it for as long as I need it.
Yes.
So I can only answer those questions if I know why I have that information in my possession.
True.
Anton, what is the risk for a business when they don't comply to PoPIA?
So there's the first and most obvious risk is a non-compliance, the penalties that the Act impose. And these penalties are quite stiff. There's financial penalties of up to 10 million rand, but there's also potential imprisonment of up to 10 years. What we mustn't forget is that when you are faced with a charge and when you are faced with potential penalties of that nature, there's necessarily also costs involved to try and mitigate against that fine or try and get yourself proven innocent. One of the other things that does not come out of the Act, but is a very high cost of non-compliance, is the harm you suffer outside of the penalty. So there's reputational harm. And, you know, all of us watching here today would know that when there's big breaches, people know about it. There's a breach that we will touch on just now that's quite common public knowledge, and that causes reputational harm. Now, there's a cost to recover your reputation. There's a cost to manage that reputational harm while it's ongoing. So those are the hidden costs. And really, when you take all of those costs and you bundle it all together, then as a general rule, it's actually more expensive to be non-compliant than it is to be compliant. So stated more positively, it's cheaper to be compliant than to be non-compliant. But there's a flip side to this also. There's for companies that can show a real genuine effort to be compliant has a massive marketing value, because when you are bidding for business in a competitive environment, then being able to show that you are doing your damnedest to be compliant, and I use those words because we said compliance is a journey, but when you're showing your genuine effort to be responsible in managing the information of your customer to be, you are more likely to win that business than somebody who has an obvious blasé approach to it. And so we mustn't just look at the fear, uncertainty, and doubt element of the penalties and fines, but we must look at the opportunity cost of being compliant and losing that because you can't show that.
And Anton, what are the common misbeliefs or myths around PoPIA?
Sure, there's quite a few.
Yeah.
I think the first thing is that you know, I find people say, you know, my business is so small, PoPIA doesn't apply to me. I'm a sole proprietor, or you know, it's a one-man band. And the reality is PoPIA applies to every person that processes personal information outside of the exceptions. Now, the exceptions are for family use, for artistic purposes, or for journalistic purposes, prevention of crime. So there's a few, but generally you can accept that if you are working with somebody else's personal information, that PoPIA applies to you. And to show you how easy it is, you cannot issue an invoice without having somebody's personal information, because that must be on the invoice. So unless you plan not to ever invoice somebody, PoPIA applies to your business. So that's the first, I think, misconception. Another misconception I find is that people think that PoPIA applies only to electronic data.
Mm.
And so there's a huge focus on IT security and cyber security. And that's a very important part of the process, and I think Richard will speak to that just now. But we must understand that PoPIA applies to any personal information in whatever form, on whatever medium. If you intend to use it in an organized, structured way in your business, it applies to that. So even if it's like Steve said, even if it's just a piece of paper in a filing cabinet, PoPIA applies to that.
Is it certified? Can you certify, be, you know, certifiable?
Actually, a very valid point. PoPIA it requires people to do an evaluation of their businesses and do a risk-based sort of evaluation and implement measures for risk. So there's no structured set of objective tick boxes that you can measure your compliance by and say, oh, I can tick all of these boxes, or I can tick 95 out of 100 boxes, therefore I get a certificate that I am compliant. And you know, it's a bugbear of mine, people that offer services where they promise PoPIA compliance certification, or people trying to advertise their services to you on the basis that they have been certified compliant. That's not possible because there's no measure against which the certification can be issued. What PoPIA requires people is to implement standards that are relevant to their business and the risk in their business, but also relevant to the industry that they're in. So for somebody in the financial services sector, there will be different standards than somebody, for example, in the information sector. Because you have bodies like SABRIC in the information center, and you'll have bodies like the Internet Service Providers Association in the communication sector. So all of these things make that you don't have one single consolidated objective set of measurements. So you can have yourself ISO certified, but you cannot have yourself PoPIA certified.
And data residency?
So data residency, I'm not sure whether that's really a myth, but I think it's a misunderstanding more than a myth.
Yeah.
So data residency touches on where our data is kept and where we keep the personal information of our customers or our suppliers and stakeholders that we engage with through our businesses. Now what it boils down to is that your golden rule of thumb is that your personal information must always be stored in South Africa. But there you can store outside of South Africa, but there's a few rules to that. The one is that you need your data subjects' consent. The other is that the information must be stored in a jurisdiction where they have laws similar to PoPIA. And if there's no law similar to PoPIA, that company must have a policy within itself that is similar to PoPIA in terms of standards of protecting and the integrity of that personal information. Where the misunderstanding, or the myth as we maybe want to call it, is that people don't always realize that they send information overseas. And I think the biggest, easiest example to use is email. You know, if you use Gmail for your business, then your emails are served on Google servers all across the world. If you use Office 365, then your emails are stored on Microsoft servers in Northern Ireland. If you use a billing system that's a cloud-based billing system, and it's likely that it may be some Eastern European country where that cloud-based billing system is hosted. So, you know, unbeknownst, if you quickly look at your email and your billing system, you've got your personal information scattered across the world, and you don't even know that. And if you even knew that, how would you know that if your billing system is hosted in, let's say, the Ukraine? How would you know what the Ukrainian laws look like and whether that meets the standards of PoPIA? So data residency is something that people don't really apply as much thought to as they should. And unfortunately, to be able to do that, you also need to understand the technology you use in your business.
And another thing I wanted to touch on is, does PoPIA prohibit you from processing data?
No, I think that's a huge misunderstanding also. PoPIA, and I think it's the way that PoPIA is marketed and consumer rights are marketed. But PoPIA does not prohibit anybody from using personal information. What it does do, it regulates how that information is processed. And also another myth is that you cannot process in my information without my consent. Consent is but one element. There are many other instances where personal information can be processed without consent. So no, PoPIA does not prohibit the processing of personal information. Rather, it governs the responsible processing of that information. And in certain circumstances, consent would be required.
And personal information, is it only related to individuals?
No. Personal information is information about individuals. Individuals are Richard and myself and Steve and yourself, but also related to companies. And that's a big difference also between South Africa and other foreign data laws, like, for example, GDPR. We're all very familiar with GDPR, but in South Africa, personal information is also information about legal persons. Now, legal persons would be a closed corporation, it would be a company, it would be a
like a trust.
Trust is a quasi-legal person, but I would say that a trust also has that attributes that would fall under personal information. Yes. So I've heard people say, I don't deal with consumers, I only deal wholesale with businesses, so PoPIA doesn't apply to me. That's very, very wrong.
Okay.
Like I say, if your business issues an invoice, PoPIA applies to you. End of story.
Could I ask a question on that to Anton? The whole thing we spoke earlier about data lifecycle management, and the whole thing of de-identification and re-identification of information. Could you explain that a little bit as well?
Okay, so maybe if you just ask me what's behind the question.
Okay, I'm just interested to know from a lifecycle management perspective.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think at the core and at the essence, if you must keep data, like I said, the principle of minimality, you must keep data only as long as you need to keep it. So that involves a process where you need to see, why do I have this data and how long must I keep it? So typically that's where we get involved with the data retention schedules. And you would, just as an example, I'm veering off the question a bit, but I just want to set the background.
Relevant, yeah.
I have your information to process an invoice, right? And under the Tax Administration Act, I must keep an invoice for at least 7 years. For argument's sake, I'm not a tax expert, so don't hold me to the period. But the example is just the illustration that there's a law that says I must keep it for at least that long. Right, then I know that the purpose for keeping, we spoke about data mapping, is to invoice you, and I have to keep that invoice for 7 years. After 7 years, I'm going to destroy the invoice. So if the last time we did business was 7 years ago, then that's 7 years. And again, I just re-stress the 7 years is just an example. Just don't hold me to it. Now, PoPIA says I can keep data for longer periods, but then one of the conditions is that I de-identify the data. In other words, it's not possible to identify the individual. Almost a bit counterintuitive, because the definition of personal information is information about an identifiable living person or a company. A company can't die, but can be liquidated, right? So once it's de-identified, I can't identify, it's actually not personal information anymore. And so I can use that for statistical purposes or for research purposes. And that's one of the exceptions, again, under the Act. Not sure what the question is around re-identification.
Or when you bring it back again,
yes.
you keep it in the place because you might want to use it again. Yeah.
But then you would certainly, that's one of the instances where you would need consent.
Yeah.
Again, yeah.
Because you can only use information that you collect for the purpose that you collect it for.
Yep.
That's why it's important to know why am I keeping this information. Now, if I'm going to re-identify data for a particular purpose that's not the same as the previous one, I can't do that without the consent of my customers.
Thanks.
Richard, I want to come to you. With your experience in cybersecurity, you must have seen some interesting breaches. Can you tell us some interesting ones?
Yeah, Jeanette, it's actually quite interesting because, you know, we always think of cyber breaches from a ransomware perspective, and a lot of the times ransomware could be a crypto ransomware that encrypts our data and locks us out of it. But what a lot of people also don't realize is there's versions of ransomware that will actually lie silently in your environment for months, and it's actually stealing your data. And that information can then obviously be sold on the black market to organizations. I mean, you think about a list of credit card users and how that can be used. If you look at the Irish Health, you know, the data that was stolen there, they were generating fake invoices to patients and saying, you know, you have overdue accounts. If we look at the latest one in South Africa, TransUnion, I mean, that's a massive breach. Again, was done through, you know, a version of data breach. But if you take even the cyber aspect out of it, a simple thing, I always like to use the analogy of, you know, we're sitting now in a period of COVID, we're gathering everybody that comes into a building's details for COVID reasons, as well as a visitor's register, okay? And it's an open book. If somebody's not actually monitoring that continuously and I take a photograph of it, you know, that company is held liable. Again, the biggest aspect of a breach as well could be down to human error. And a prime example of this is, you know, if I had to go and send out an email to a group of individuals requesting information or updating records or something like that, and, you know, all the people in the email are visible in the CC, so we don't use blind CCs, or we don't use some kind of bulk mailer, you know, we're kind of infringing on, or we are infringing on PoPIA, especially if the spreadsheet that we're asking to update is across all of those partners. So, you know, that's kind of one example.
Just to jump in there, Richard, just to illustrate a point, I was asked to review a contract last week, and the email that was that the information was attached was forwarded to me, and I noticed that they just copied everybody in it, and literally within 2 minutes I had a spreadsheet of 485 names and email addresses.
That's quite scary.
Yeah.
You know, and what a cool hunting list all of a sudden.
I was going to ask you that.
So I didn't use it, but you know, we had
how
a breach.
easy it happens.
We had a breach there because somebody,
yeah,
you know, disclosed 485 individuals' names with their email addresses.
Yeah, I mean, how many times have you received an email, you know, to Richard someone, but they've sent it to you accidentally, you know, to Anton Kotze instead of, you know, Anton Smith or something like that. I mean, that's a quick fraudulent slip, so to speak, you know, but that's a breach of PoPIA. So the human error aspect is always available. And I think, again, that's where the Act is very clever. You know, we trying to get everybody to become PoPIA compliant to a degree. So we're going on this journey of PoPIA compliance, but we'll never reach an end goal because specifically from a cyber risks perspective, there's things like human error. There's things like zero-day attacks that you can't foresee. So you can become maybe 99.9%, you know, compliant or protected, but there's always that one possibility, that 0.1% possibility of a breach happening and your data getting stolen. So I think, again, from a cyber perspective, as long as you can show that you are doing your best to mitigate that risk, you know, you would then become PoPIA compliant. And I think, again, from a breach perspective, it's how you deal with that breach, how you make the knowledge, the breach public knowledge, you know, and disclose what was stolen. That also impacts on the PoPIA, you know, aspects of it.
So I think Richard makes a very valid point, and it almost goes back to your question around myths. Right? A breach, an incident, is not necessarily evidence of non-compliance. The compliance lies in the efforts made to be responsible. But the act almost has an underlying assumption that at some point there will be a breach in your business, and then dealing with that breach as responsibly as possible. That is also compliance. So there are certain objective things that one can measure against the act. But like Richard said, it's a never-ending journey. That doesn't mean we don't stop. So we must never say, I must now, you know, run my business so that I never ever have a data breach, because that's not the goal. The goal is to make sure that I'm as responsible as possible to mitigate against a breach. But if a breach occurs, how then do I manage and deal with that breach?
So on that point, Steve, if a customer or a business experiences a breach, what are the steps that they need to take?
Well, once you know that there's been a breach, whether you're notified by a data subject or other ways, the immediate thing you need to do is obviously report it to the information regulator, because that's the first step. And then obviously also you need to report it back to the data subject to tell them, you're aware of what's happened and you're putting a response plan in place to deal with it. And I think that's quite a key thing, that response plan, which means you should have a proper incident response team within your business who have been trained on incident response and how to deal with it. But everybody in the business knows who those people are, who's the lead, and who are the team members. And they should actually meet immediately. It shouldn't be like meet tomorrow, 48 hours. It's like as soon as they know about it, they should meet and discuss the whole thing and how they're going to mitigate it, but also remediate it. Remediate is even more important, because mitigate just means you're doing something about it for now, but remediation means you're taking it further. You're actually going further along the line to say, well, we don't want this to happen again, and we're going to make sure we close it out. Obviously, then as well, the other aspect of it is if it's another party that's had the breach, in other words, a processor on your behalf who's processing your information. Like, let's say, for example, you've got a company that does all your debit orders. You don't deal with them yourself. They have a breach. They lose all your clients' details, banking details, everything. They'll notify you, hopefully first, and then you would obviously, in the same process, you'd have to notify the people who've been breached from the data subject point of view. But always remember, you are still responsible, even though that third party is doing it on your behalf and you've got an agreement with them in place. It's still your responsibility to deal with it.
And you mentioned hopefully first, but PoPIA, one of the things that one of the objective things that we can measure compliance against is whether you have written agreements with people who process information on your behalf. And you should govern all of that in that agreement to say, when you get breached, you notify me first, because I am the responsible party and I have certain obligations. So one shouldn't leave it to hopefully. One should still hopefully they comply with their contract, but it should be regulated in that contract, and that contract is a very objective legal requirement. And again, to the data mapping, part of that will also be to identify who you should have these data processing agreements with.
Yeah, and I think also what's important there, Anton, is the whole reviewing process as well.
Yes.
To make sure you're reviewing those contracts, even not just waiting till they've expired, but during the process, how are they performing? Even perhaps doing even audits if necessary.
Correct.
Yep, you could probably add then to the fact that if you are using a third party, you'd want to make sure that whatever compliance you're adhering to, they're adhering to the same thing. I mean, if you using a debt collection agency or a debit order agent, you don't want to use somebody who doesn't conform with the same level of standards that you do. It's quite interesting as well that those third parties not only take the data that you've given them for the collection, but they actually enhance that data themselves. If I can't get hold of a customer on this mobile number, but I find an alternative number, I'm not adding to that personal information. So when there is a breach, they've not only got your information, they've got their enhanced information that's been breached as well.
Just to add that as well, Richard, don't forget about fourth parties.
Yeah.
It's very important. I mean, if you're a third party and you've got some of the information that fourth parties are helping you with the process.
Correct.
Same principle.
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen it with some financial institutions, large banks, where they've used a third party as a broker, and the broker's actually been breached, and they've used the information from breaching the broker to then breach the financial institution. So, this is continuous downward trail of who's got access to the data, who's collecting that data, and who's processing it.
Richard, as we've seen in recent years, cyber attacks in South Africa has increased exponentially. How would you recommend a business protects, especially looking from an electronic point of view, the data on electronic format?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. I mean, we had the conversation earlier about how much do I invest against the risk? So, if you can try and mitigate as much risk without, overspending, those are the kinds of areas you want to focus on. But we normally look at the different aspects of implementing strategies like zero trust. Okay, so to give you an example, that I think it was Experian, where they just transferred a whole lot of information over to a fake customer. Okay, if that verified that that organization actually existed, that wouldn't have happened. So that's the zero trust, you know. So prove you are who you say you are before I give you the data. Okay. Another aspect would be the mitigation of risk against the ransomware attack. All right, whatever attack is going to take my data, you know, create a breach that will take data, we need to make sure there's things in place. So that could be things like email security, because you know, email is probably 95% of ransomware attacks originate via an email. So it's probably a good place to focus. Your endpoint security, to make sure that that ransomware can't attach to your devices and actually pull that information. Okay. Then I would say your data control aspect of it. You know, there's the aspect of data discovery, classification, and control. So where does my data sit? All right, we've heard of, you know, users with a Windows 10 machine sitting under their desk and they've got a whole lot of data on. Okay, but there's also legacy servers sitting in a data somewhere that's totally uncontrolled. There's data sitting on web servers that shouldn't be there, that's open to the internet, that you can access very quickly. A simple thing like your CCTV camera, do you know how much damage you could get just by accessing the CCTV camera and using that viewing of information on a screen, you know, against an organization? And then there's the control and the classification of that data. So has the right person got access to that data, right? And if they do have the right access, what are they allowed to do with that information? Okay, and I'll give an example of incorrect Active Directory structures. You know, you've got people that have got access to shared drives that shouldn't have, and they now have the ability to take that information, right? And then I think the last thing from a cybersecurity mitigation that everybody should be looking at is user awareness training. Okay, train the users to become more effective, to become more first-line defenders of your data, right, and make them cognizant of their actions and what the impact to your data is going to be, right? So things like password policies, identifying a potential cyber attack. I looked at an example just the other day where there was a fake invoice sent to the customer, and from my experience in cyber, I spotted 15 reasons why that invoice was fake. Okay, whereas an uneducated user would have looked at it and thought, cool, let me pay this invoice. All right, so that's kind of where companies should focus. But again, you know, mitigate your risk based on what you can afford. But again, don't see it as a grudge purchase. You know, if you look at a SMB having to fork out 4 million rand on a breach versus, you know, 3,000 rand to defend against that, you know, you need to kind of weigh up those costs. And then your reputational damage is a cost, and your insurance claims is again a cost.
Yeah. Steve, Richard briefly spoke about awareness training. You've offered as part of your consultation the whole journey. What does an effective training plan look like?
It's a good question. I always like to refer back to the good old ISO standards when it comes to that, because if you look at what they describe it as when you look at training, they call it competency, training, and awareness. Okay, and there's a reason for that, because if you look at training in most cases, if you look at it when you train someone, you're going up like a curve like this, and they're right up here now. You've trained them up, they've got their certificate, they've got their ticks, they've got their gold star, and then they're going to file it away. Hopefully there's no personal information on it. And then it drops down here because there's no other training done. And most companies look at it like that. So the only way you can really control that is by having a competency-based approach, where you start saying, okay, we need to make sure that they've acquired the knowledge, the skills, whatever it is that we want them to have to attain. So that's my first point. So when you say what type of training, and I look at awareness differently, training would be more the deep dive from a PoPIA point of view. So certainly your senior people, your information officers, your deputy officer, if you've got one, and even your champions, because I like to see champions in the different divisions or departments. Yeah. They need to get in-depth training on PoPIA. But the other interesting part is the IT part, or the cyber part, as you mentioned. It's interesting to know that if you look at cyber statistics across the world, between 85 and 90% of data breaches occur because of human error. It's not because of somebody being willfully an insider doing it on purpose by sabotage. That does happen. Someone might leave and feel, I'm going to get back at you. It's mostly people, it's because of human error, because as Richard said earlier, they did not realize. Like the invoice you mentioned, they did not realize. And so a lot of companies just focus on the IT part, which is important. Cyber breaches, I mean, it is the most one, but they forget about the records. So the awareness training needs to focus on all of that. And everybody should be trained. Every single person should have awareness training, not just some, all. I look at one of my clients we finished last year, they had 23,000 people trained, all of their staff on PoPIA. It took 6 months, but that's what they did.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, they must be competent. You should have refresher training that's ongoing as part of your training plan. Any changes to the act that come in, anything in the cyber side that comes in that changes, any new systems you bring in that change things, that do things differently, all those things apply. And it's about people. If you look at quality from my background in the aircraft industry in my earlier years, you know, there's no place for mistakes, but people do make mistakes, and it's mostly people that cause the problems. So keep on training them, ongoing. Yeah,
It almost has to become a way of life.
it
Yeah.
is.
You know, you need to be so ingrained. You know, simple example is training your receptionists to hide your guest registers if they leave their desk, so nobody can access it. You know, or the security guards at the gate don't hand a book to somebody to sign and then walk over to another car to let them out. You know, you've now lost visibility of the register, and it is something that needs to be ingrained in you. You need to become aware of your actions and how they impact the business, and then becomes a way of life.
It's true.
And that's why simply going online, downloading a privacy policy and filing it on your server somewhere and now feel that you are compliant is not the right way to go. Because what PoPIA does, it forces us to rethink everything we do and to consider, and if you do this properly, to like Richard has just used the security or the sign-in register as an example, where we've got to change how we do things, and for a particular reason. So it really does need us to apply our minds. Simply just downloading a template policy and saying, there we go, we're now compliant, is really not the way to go.
Yeah, it's all about changing the corporate culture or the company culture. How would you do that?
Well, that's the whole thing, isn't it? Leadership starts at the top.
Yeah.
And I think leadership needs to model it. So what I've been sharing now about becomes a way of life. They need to be the ones who are leading that way of life to the rest of the people. And you know, we speak about the PoPIA journey, which is a lovely storyline, but you know, you're only compliant until your first breach occurs. You know, that's the reality. And then all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose, because now we've got a breach. So it's expected to happen. It's going to happen sooner or later. The gravity and level of it can vary, but it is going to happen sooner or later. So at the end of the day, you know, you can't avoid it. So from a cultural point of view, it's what we've already said. Everybody should understand what you're doing in your business. They should know all they need to know to do their job properly and to protect things. So when you leave your desk, clear your desk, put stuff away. If you've got some confidential documents, have a lockable drawer that you can lock them in and go and have your coffee or go for lunch or whatever. Clear desk screen policy, you know, where you've got your nice screen on there, nice big Dell monitor, you know, but after a minute or so, it should shut off and you come back in, you've got to type your password in to get in again. Yeah. All these things are, you know, USB sticks. I see them all over the place lying around. You know, oh, pick it up, take it. What's on it? Oh, that's interesting. All these things, you know, are important. Fax machine, which aren't used much these days, obviously a printer. I've seen people, they leave the printing, someone prints something, they forget it.
Yeah.
They leave it in a tray, please collect here, but you can go and have a look through it. You could find all sorts of things in there. So these are the type of things that are ongoing. So the whole thing of the culture then becomes what you do and how you do it. And at the end of the day, you know, as I said earlier to you chaps, you know, communication, 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 and communication. It's an ongoing thing, and you can't really avoid it. It's the way it should be all the time.
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting because some of the data protection programs that are out there now, you know, for argument's sake, I go to Anton and I ask him about some legal advice, and he pulls something up on his screen that he shows me, and then he turns around to grab a file, and as he does it, I try to take a picture of the screen, you know, and these programs actually spot the fact that you try to take a picture. They black the screen up, but they then use the webcam to take a picture of you taking a picture.
Really?
Which is quite interesting, you know. But I mean, that's an example of data loss through a cell phone. So yeah. That's
Yeah,
a
but
fascinating industry.
I just want to give you an example of way of life. Okay,
Yeah.
maybe this will hit home a bit. I think when I was 6 years old and lived in the UK, we got burgled. Okay, so I woke up and I stood at the top of the stairs, right, and looked down, and there was this guy down the bottom with a whole pile of stuff. And I said, "Who are you?" You know. Luckily, my father came through and, you know, caught this guy because he was an ex-boxing champion, my father. So he sorted it out. But since that day, security has been key in my life. You know, it's become a way of life to make sure all around me that things are safe, secure, my home's secure.
Mm.
Even when I'm driving, I look four cars ahead and I look behind as well. And that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And it's the same at work, you know, it just becomes part of you. And I think that's what is needed.
Mm.
Not easy though.
No,
But
no, it takes time.
yeah.
Anton, Richard touched earlier about electronic or protecting electronic data. What about physical data? How would you advise a company to protect that?
So, you know, I think we've sort of alluded to that throughout this entire conversation, that PoPIA, and we touched on it with the myths as well, as PoPIA applies to all personal information. It's an act that governs information, not media.
Mm.
So whether it's a paper, whether it's hard copy, or like Steve calls it a record, or whether it's an electronic form on a memory stick or on a server in the cloud somewhere, PoPIA applies to the information that you have in your possession. So it applies equally, and all the principles apply equally. But I just want to touch on some things. The good news is that if you're sitting watching and you've got a small business, maybe 5 employees, nobody expects you to go and implement the same measures that you would expect of an ABSA or a Standard Bank. So the good news about PoPIA is that your compliance also swivels around a balance. So the measures you need to put in place needs to be balanced with the risks that are there. So it's very much a risk-based approach. And you'll see a lot of risk methodologies coming into your PoPIA compliance, because it's an evaluation of what are the risks, how do I mitigate it, and those mitigation measures. And then obviously, just to complete the cycle, a review, and you start the process again. But those mitigation measures must be in line with the risk. So if you're a small company with very limited personal information, then your risk of a breach is much smaller than somebody like an Experian or an ITC or an ABSA or a Standard Bank. I'm not picking on them, I'm just using them as illustrations, right? So you don't have to employ the same measures. And I think that's why you should have that consultative approach, understand where that balance lies, where the responsible balance lies, and then have the appropriate measures implemented. Talking about forgetting paper in a printer, right? It's for free to set your multi-function printer to have a user box that you enter your PIN when you collect the documents from the printer. So if I print and I get busy, then I know that my stuff's not lying in the printer. I'll go, but it's for free. So that's a simple measure that you can implement as a small business that's very effective. The last point I want to make, I see a lot of clients that have got wonderful culture and wonderful modalities and methodologies in their business, but they never reduce to writing what they do. And unfortunately, we must. So if we say that we're going to enter a PIN before we collect our stuff from the printer, reduce these things to writing. Put it in a policy and a process, because that's your proof one day when there is a breach, that you've done your damnedest under the circumstances and within all of the balancing acts to be as compliant as possible. So, you know, that's where policies come into play. We don't do policies to tick a box and say we're compliant. We do policies to actually record what we've decided for ourselves to implement as our way of doing things.
It's very true what you're saying. I always say to clients over the years, you know, just write what you do and do what you write down.
Yes.
That's it. And then the nice part of it is with PoPIA, if you know your risks, it makes that a bit easier for you, because you can see these are the ones I really need to put more detail, and this is where I need to less focus. So yeah, don't wait for the what if.
Yeah.
Do it now.
And I think maybe just to add one point that should be part of the whole PoPIA process. We look at it from a PoPIA perspective. How does it pertain to the data in South Africa, South Africans? But if you're a company that's processing data on behalf of international customers, right, are we also conforming to that region's equivalent, personal information rules? And I'll give an example. If you look at the number of expats from South Africa that are now living in Europe, but are still buying things from, let's say, Takealot or wherever it is, does a company like that keep those personal records? All right. And if there's a breach in South Africa for that organization, how does it impact on the GDPR rules?
Yeah, fact. Richard, if a business needs assistance with their PoPIA journey, I mean, we've at Omata have got the PoPIA advisory services. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, Jeanette. So I think if anybody is interested in starting that journey towards PoPIA readiness or PoPIA compliancy, they can reach out to either account manager or key account manager or a BDM. We can set up an introductory meeting. We can go with our partner Wolfpack into the organization. I think it's also important to understand, Wolfpack are experts in this area, and it's also a third party, so we kind of not marking our own homework. The information that you're getting is relevant to you. We're not influencing the outcome, all right? But we would have that initial engagement. We would assess the requirements. We would put a proposal together for the customer, and based on the amount of work required, the client can determine how we progress from there. I think as a follow-up, if we do realize that there are areas where the client needs to improve certain things, we can assist them in that. And I think what's also key, I mean, we spoke about how do you deal with a breach, is putting things in. I mean, this is something that's existed for quite a long time, is something like a CSIRT process. How do we document a incident response process for the organization that involves management, involves legal, it involves marketing, so we can actually, mitigate the impact of that breach in the market, as well as the actual team that's going to be doing the resolution of the breach, and follow up, securing the environment so that breach doesn't happen again, or maybe it's, more training that needs to happen. So I think we'll start off with that advisory service. We'll define, that PoPIA journey, and then there's obviously services that Omata could assist the customer with on the back end from those findings, to help them along that journey.
Anything else you guys want to add? I think we've reached the end. Shall we have a look if we've got some questions from the viewers? Okay, here's one. Who is responsible for implementing PoPIA? Steve?
Who is responsible? Every company, small to large.
In the company, the information officer bears the ultimate responsibility in each company. And the Act defines an information officer is not somebody we choose because we delegate down all the stuff we don't want to do. The Act defines the information officer as the head of the body. So it's the managing director, the CEO, that person. That person can appoint deputy information officers to assist him, but he bears the ultimate responsibility. So every owner-managed business, every business with a managing director or a CEO or any country manager, any title of that nature indicating that I am the ultimate decision maker in this business, is the head of the body, is the information officer, must be registered with the information regulator, and bears the ultimate responsibility to ensure that PoPIA becomes a way of life in that business.
Yeah.
And that's your steering committee, basically, we were talking about earlier.
In bigger companies, remember, a three-man business is not going to have a steering committee.
Yes. Here's another question. What are the bare minimum requirements that should be in place?
Bare minimum.
I would say probably a written document that explains how you process your personal information and how you protect it. I don't know, what are your thoughts, Anton?
I think as a bare minimum, it's difficult, but as a bare minimum, and I'll tell you why it's difficult, because there's so much moving parts to this engine, that, how do you say, what's the bare minimum of a gearbox of a car? Well, all of it. That's the answer, because without it, you don't have a working gearbox. But I would say as a starting point is that consultative process where we really look at that mapping. What information do we have? Where is it kept? How is it kept? Why is it kept? And then what risks do a breach pose? And from there, you have your starting blocks to look at what tools you need to start getting everything responsibly in place. So I would say if I had to formulate a bare minimum, it's that process where we really apply our mind to what we've got and then do that risk analysis of that.
I agree. Yeah.
One last question. Are there any benefits in complying with PoPIA?
I mentioned that, absolutely. I think PoPIA, through marketing, through various commercial enterprises, PoPIA is very much front of mind. Our right to privacy is very much front of mind. So being compliant puts your market at ease that their rights are being taken seriously. And you can turn that into a massive value add. We sell on price and we sell on value. So price is what the market dictates. You can't do much about that. But value is something you can do a lot about. And your compliance and how serious you take the rights of your customers is massive value. And if you're able to articulate that correctly, it can be very, very important for you.
Yeah, I think if you also add assurance to that as well, it assures you that, and your clients, that you're doing what you can do about it, and it also gives you peace of mind to know that you've got that assurance in place.
Yeah.
Also very important.
Well, thank you, guys. Thank you for joining me today and for all your advice, and thank you for joining us. If you need information, please get in touch, and then we'll see you again soon. Goodbye.
You got again, I've got the flower, you've got your pride, I've got my shame, you've got your luck. Why the hell is mine where you don't? I'm right. You got again, I've got the flower, you've got your pride, I've got my shame, you've got your luck. Why the hell is mine where you don't? I'm not the flame, you are the first. Let me explode, let me burst, let me show, 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 show. Sun is getting, the song is ready, for the sun. heart is done. Sun is getting, sun is getting, close to sun. Out of the sun is getting, sun is getting, close to sun. Out of the sun is getting, sun is getting, close to sun. Out of the sun. How long have I been on the hunt for you? No sound of anything that I can do, but I don't mind, 'cause there's nothing left to lose. And for the first time, I'm calling out for you, like anymore. Still got love for you. Oh, still got love for you. Hear me calling. I'm calling for you. Like anymore. I still got love for you. I'm coming home for you. Sun's glad washing up against the shore. Sweet love, you're the one that I adore. And I don't mind if I'm running after you. It's been a long time